It was just after 6:30 when Miss Jane Marple stepped out of the hired carriage at the edge of Ravenbridge Lane, her gloved hand tightening lightly on the walking stick she seldom used but always carried. A faint wind brushed against her cheek, cool for September, and from somewhere beyond the thicket came the final note of a nightingale's song, a long, low, almost questioning tone that hovered in the twilight like a breath held too long. Before her stood the Keene cottage, its whitewashed stones weathered, its shutters slightly askew as though wincing from some old pain. Marjorie Keene met her at the gate, wrapped in a thick shawl despite the mild air. Her face bore a softness that could only have been earned through persistent grief. Eyes rimmed red, not from recent tears, but from too many cried silently alone. "He hasn't played in years," she said without preamble, voice nearly a whisper as she led Miss Marple up the pebbled path. Not since Henry." Miss Marple nodded gently, saying nothing. She had known enough mothers in mourning to recognize, when words could not offer comfort, only burden. Inside, the house smelled faintly of varnish and time, like rooms that once held music and now held only its echo. The sitting room was dim, the curtains drawn halfway, and on the sideboard rested a dark violin case, closed, latched, but somehow not still. It seemed to vibrate quietly, as though the very memory of music had unsettled the air. Marjorie paused before it. "Last night," she said, "just after midnight, I heard it, the violin. A single note, full, clear, hanging in the house like smoke. Alistair was asleep. No one else was here. I checked the locks twice." Miss Marple stepped closer, observing the instrument's case, with practiced calm. She did not touch it. Her gaze moved instead to the wallpaper just behind it, slightly curled at the edge. The kind of curl one sees in old houses, often overlooked, yet oddly poignant. Everything here seemed paused, waiting, watching. She turned to Marjorie. "And he has truly not played since?" "No," Marjorie replied, her voice thinning. "He couldn't. After Henry died, the music left him. He said it was no longer his to hold." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the violin, silent within its shell, and she thought of how grief, like melody, often returned when one least expected it, not with fanfare, but with a whisper, and she wondered, as she always did when something odd stirred in the quiet, was it a memory returning to haunt? Or something else, something someone meant to be heard? Outside, the wind carried a leaf across the stone sill. The night settled around the cottage like an old wool coat, warm in some places, heavy in others, and somewhere far off, the last trace of the nightingale's song dissolved into silence. Morning came to Ravenbridge Lane not with fanfare, but with an overcast hush, as if even the clouds had agreed to move more gently over the cottage roof. Miss Marple, already dressed and seated in the small breakfast nook beside the hearth, watched steam rise from her tea with the quiet patience of someone long attuned to the subtle language of households. Every home, she believed, whispered if one listened properly, not in voices, but in the small changes. A drawer left half open, a pattern disturbed in the dust, the scent of something no longer cooked. Alistair Keene entered without announcement. He looked older in the morning light, thinner, the corners of his eyes shadowed with long-neglected sleep. He wore a cardigan buttoned wrong by one, and his hands trembled faintly as he reached for the chair across from her. "You mustn't let Marjorie frighten you," he said after a moment. "She's grown sensitive to sounds. Grief does that. You begin to hear what isn't there." Miss Marple didn't argue. She simply said, "And you? Did you hear it?" Alistair hesitated, the question hanging in the air between them. "No," he replied, "but I dreamed of it." He rubbed his thumb across his palm, an old habit, she guessed, from years of holding a bow. "In the dream, I was a child again. The strings were new, the rosin sharp, and Henry was there, just behind me, listening." A silence passed between them, not awkward, but fragile. Miss Marple glanced briefly at the violin case, still shut tight on the sideboard. "May I see the instrument?" she asked. Alistair nodded slowly. "It hasn't been touched in years. You'll find it dusty and reluctant." She opened the case delicately, her fingers tracing the metal clasp as though it might flinch. Inside, the violin rested like something asleep, its body still gleaming faintly with the residue of past concerts, its strings intact but dull with disuse. Miss Marple noted something strange. A fine thread of horsehair clung loosely to the edge of the bow, frayed as though pulled or snapped under pressure. She said nothing aloud but turned the violin gently to observe its back. The wood was cool. No warmth lingered there, but as she examined the curve of the neck, she noticed a single thin scratch, a faint crescent, fresh and slightly raised. Not from time, but from recent touch. "Mr. Keene," she said softly, "are you quite sure no one handled this last night?" Alistair looked up. His eyes flickered, just once, but the flicker was unmistakable. "I said I didn't hear it," he replied slowly. "I never said no one touched it." Miss Marple studied him. His gaze was not defensive but tired, as if he carried not guilt, but the weight of something left too long unsaid. Outside, a breeze rattled the shutters faintly, and the sound reminded her oddly of a bough brushing gently over string. "You keep the windows closed at night?" she asked. "Always," he said, "especially since the boy." He stopped himself. Miss Marple did not press. She stood instead and walked to the conservatory door, drawing it open to the narrow garden path beyond. The morning dew shimmered faintly on the grass, and she noticed something odd in the soil just below the window. 2 footprints, small, pressed slightly inward, childlike. She crouched, brushing the dirt aside with a handkerchief. One of the footprints had a slight dragging edge, as if the foot that made it had been unsure, unsteady. Someone had stood here, recently, watching, listening. As she rose, she glanced back at the house and felt, for the first time, the faint pressure of something unspoken coiling around the place like ivy. Not haunting, but heavy with memory. She would need to listen more closely, because someone, was playing again, but not for music, for memory, or for forgiveness. And always, Miss Marple knew, the truth began with listening to the notes people tried not to play. The late afternoon at Ravenbridge Cottage descended with the kind of stillness that made time feel suspended, like a note held too long on a string instrument, vibrating just beneath the threshold of hearing. Miss Marple had taken a seat once again in the parlor, knitting idle in her lap, though her eyes were not on her needles. They were fixed on the corner of the floor, beneath the music stand. The room, she sensed, had learned to carry sound differently, as though something once shared here had broken and never been spoken of again. Marjorie Keene entered with a tray, tea, 2 cups, and a folded napkin embroidered with violets. Her hands were steady now, but her eyes still carried a bruised sort of worry, as though she had slept with one ear open for too many years. She placed the tray down gently. "He was in that room last night," she said, not looking at Miss Marple. "Alistair, after I'd gone to bed. I didn't see him, but I heard the creak of the music stool. Just once." Miss Marple stirred her tea slowly. "And you didn't go to him?" Marjorie gave a tired smile. "He doesn't need an audience anymore. Not since Henry." The boy's name lingered between them, not pushed forward like a confession, but not hidden either. It hung there, unfinished, like a phrase in an unfinished score. Miss Marple said nothing, waiting. After a moment, Marjorie continued. "He used to play for him every night. Henry would fall asleep curled in that old armchair, the one with the ink stain, and Alistair would play, sometimes just a lullaby, sometimes things I'd never heard before, as though the violin was saying what he couldn't." "And now?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Now he pretends the violin's broken, but it isn't." She paused. "I open the case once in a while when he's out, just to make sure it hasn't turned to ash. It hasn't. It's waiting, same as me." Miss Marple rose and walked slowly to the music stand. The wooden floor beneath it creaked, once, twice, and then, faintly, a third time, in a tone just off. She stooped. "May I?" Marjorie nodded. Miss Marple knelt and ran her fingers along the floorboards. One of them, just below the corner leg, was loose, not raised, but humming under the weight of silence. With care, she used the tip of her knitting needle to edge the board upward. Beneath it, nestled in dust and folded cloth, lay a faded sheet of music, handwritten in Alistair's familiar script. A date was penciled in the corner, April 17th, The birthday of a child lost too soon. Marjorie paled when she saw it. "That's the one," she whispered. "He wrote it the week before we lost Henry. He never played it, never even named it." Miss Marple unfolded it carefully. The notes were simple, repeating, more like a lullaby than a concerto. But as she followed the melody across the page, she felt the ache of it. It wasn't music for a stage. It was music for memory, for mourning. Grief, Miss Marple murmured, is its own language, and some speak it with silence, others with strings. She returned the sheet to its place beneath the floorboard, then replaced the plank gently. Some things, she believed, should be found, but not always kept out in the open. Later, as the sun began to dip behind the hedgerow, Miss Marple returned to her room. From the open window, she heard it again, not clearly, not fully, but just enough to know. Someone had touched the bow. The violin had stirred, and the house, long still, had drawn breath. But the music wasn't for performance. It was a message, and it was only just beginning. Evening deepened like ink drawn slow across parchment as Miss Marple walked the stone path behind Ravenbridge Cottage, her shawl gathered at her shoulders, the air dense with the scent of damp soil and forgotten rosemary. The garden behind the house had once been lovingly kept. One could tell by the placement of the old trellis, the disciplined arc of rose branches now curling wild with grief. She paused by the conservatory windows, fingers brushing the ivy that clung to the sill. Inside, the room was dim but not entirely still. She entered quietly. The conservatory had the mournful air of a space abandoned mid-thought. A single sheet of music sat curled on the piano's edge, notes barely visible in the failing light. Dust had settled on the ivory keys in a way that revealed absence more than neglect. And there, across the parquet floor, something caught her attention. A fine line of white shimmer trailing from the piano bench to the open window. She stepped closer, kneeling. Bow rosin. Not much, just a trace, like breath on glass, but enough. And along with it, something more unsettling. Hair. Pale, near translucent, violin bow hair, stretched and snapped, snagged in the wooden threshold where the window latch hung slightly crooked. The edges of the pane were unmarked. No glass broken, no force used. The intrusion had not been physical in the usual sense, but it had occurred. Miss Marple examined the sill and saw faint indentations, a shoe print, half-faded, small, not childlike, but certainly light of step. Not Marjorie's, not Alistair's either, whose gait was weighted with sorrow these days. She rose and moved to the window, looking out over the hedges to the far fence. A gate, almost forgotten behind tall shrubbery, hung open just enough to admit someone who knew where to push. A voice startled her. "Miss Marple." She turned. It was Mr. Palmer, the former pupil. He held a satchel against his chest, knuckles pale around the strap. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said. "I was passing and thought, well, I heard the violin again last night. From the lane. Not clearly, but it was unmistakable." She tilted her head. "And what did it play?" He hesitated. "Only a few bars. The beginning of something. Then nothing." She studied him. His eyes carried a sadness not unlike Alistair's, though younger, more restless. "You know the melody," she said gently. He nodded. "I used to hum it. Years ago. He let me read his sketches once. I copied a few measures down when he wasn't looking. It was never finished." "Yet you remember it." He gave a nervous smile. "I suppose I thought, if he never played it, someone should remember it." Miss Marple gestured to the piano. "Would you?" He hesitated, then sat slowly, opening the lid with quiet reverence. He placed the sheet music aside and let his fingers drift over the keys, not striking them, only resting, like someone recalling the feel of a long-lost conversation. Then, with hesitant grace, he played. The notes were simple, tentative. The same melody Miss Marple had seen beneath the floorboards. But as the tune unfolded, something trembled in the air. Not sorrow exactly. Longing. The kind of yearning that makes even silence feel alive. When he stopped, the room held its breath. "I never knew whose it was," he said. "I thought maybe it was for Marjorie. Or someone else." Miss Marple's voice was quiet. "It was for a child." He bowed his head. "I'm sorry." She walked to the side window, watching the breeze stir the ivy again. "Someone has been here, Mr. Palmer. Someone who does not wish to be seen, but leaves traces anyway. Broken bough hairs. Rosin dust. Faint steps. Not theft, no. This is something more fragile. A return, perhaps. Or a reckoning." He looked up sharply. "You don't think, Marjorie?" "No," she said calmly. "Marjorie hides nothing. But you carry guilt. Not of misdeed, but of omission." His eyes flickered, and for a moment he seemed a boy again. "I should have come sooner. Years ago, when I knew something wasn't right." Miss Marple placed her hand lightly on his shoulder. "Some notes, Mr. Palmer. Wait until the right silence appears before they can be heard." The room darkened. Outside, the wind stirred the hedgerow, and in the hush that followed, the old violin case upstairs gave a soft thud, barely audible, but unmistakable. Something, or someone, was ready to be remembered. The morning broke slow and pale over Ravenbridge Lane, casting a hesitant light across the cottage windows, as if uncertain whether to wake what still slumbered in sorrow. In the parlor, the fire had gone out, but the embers beneath held a memory of warmth, flickering gently, like something left unsaid. Miss Marple stood by the mantel, her eyes not on the ash but on the photograph above it. Alistair and Marjorie, younger, smiling, their arms wrapped around a small boy holding a bough nearly his own height. Time had washed the image in sepia, but it hadn't dulled its ache. Marjorie entered carrying a music book bound in worn burgundy leather. She did not speak at first. Her hands were steady, though her voice had grown thinner in recent days, as though the melody of her life had been drawn into a single fragile note. "This was his," she said softly, placing the book on the table before Miss Marple. "It's where Alistair composed before the silence. He hasn't touched it since Thomas." Miss Marple opened the book gently. The pages were lined with staves, some filled with quick, brilliant notations, fragments of things once meant to be whole. Most of the entries ended mid-measure. A phrase here, a motif there, but nestled between the pages, as though waiting for breath, was a folded letter, tucked deep, hidden not in haste, but in reverence. She looked at Marjorie, who shook her head. "I didn't place it there. I found it this morning when I moved the bench. I think someone wanted me to see it." Miss Marple unfolded the paper slowly. The ink had run slightly at the edges, water-blurred. Tears or time, it was hard to say. The handwriting was unmistakably Alistair's, but the signature at the bottom was only a pair of initials, L. She read aloud in her quiet voice, the way one might read poetry not for performance, but for understanding. "There are notes I never wrote, words I couldn't say, because the sound of your breath was enough. But now the breath is gone, and silence has grown too loud. If I play again, it will not be to perform. It will be to remember, and perhaps, in remembering, to forgive." Miss Marple looked up. Marjorie was staring at her hands. Her lips trembled, but held no words. "It was never mailed," Miss Marple said gently. "It was never meant to be." She placed the letter down and turned to the fire, where the ashes had shifted slightly in the breeze from the window. "It is a confession, not of guilt, but of longing. Someone wanted this to be found now, after the violins sang." Marjorie finally spoke. "Do you think it's a goodbye?" Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "No, I believe it's a beginning." At noon, Mr. Palmer returned, this time without a satchel. He walked straight to the piano bench and sat, eyes lowered. "I remember the day Thomas fell ill. I was visiting. He wanted to hear his father play. Alistair refused. He said some music requires strength of soul he no longer possessed." Marjorie blinked. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" "I thought it wasn't my place," he said quietly. "But the boy looked at me as if I could bring the music back. I failed him." "No," Miss Marple said, her voice unwavering. "You were too young to carry such weight. But now, perhaps, you can lift it." She turned to Marjorie. The letter was left in a book, a space of music and memory, that tells us it was never meant to destroy, only to be understood. "And what do we do with understanding?" Marjorie asked. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "We let it play." And that night, For the first time in years, the violin case upstairs was opened, not in sorrow, but in stillness. Its strings had not been tuned. Its bridge was weary, but it rested in the crook of an arm that once knew how to love through sound. Alistair stood by the window, bow in hand, eyes closed. And as the first note slipped quietly into the cottage air, something unspoken, buried deep for years, stirred at last. Not an end, not even a coda, just the first breath of something unfinished. The wind curled low through the heather fields that framed Ravenbridge Lane, brushing gently against the cottage windows with a sound that resembled breath held too long. Within the quiet of the parlor, the violin case stood ajar, its lid propped delicately against the side, as though no longer afraid to be opened. But it was not music that stirred the house that night. It was something quieter and far older. It was memory. Miss Marple stood just inside the doorway, her shawl wrapped tightly about her shoulders. She did not speak, did not interrupt. Instead, she observed the scene like a gentle archivist of human emotion, eyes watchful, heart steady. Alistair was seated near the hearth, the violin resting across his knees like a relic. His hand hovered above the strings, but never touched them. Marjorie, standing beside him, seemed to hold her breath, as if afraid even to blink might break the moment. On the mantel, the clock chimed a single note. Midnight. Then, something peculiar, a sound, not from a violin but from beneath the floorboards. A thin, scraping noise, rhythmic, tentative. Alistair's fingers curled instinctively around the neck of the instrument. Miss Marple's gaze lifted slightly. The noise came again, then ceased. "I've heard that before," whispered Marjorie, "but only on nights when he held the violin." Miss Marple moved slowly toward the window, drawing back the curtain just enough to peer into the moonlit garden. A figure stood at the edge of the hedgerow, not moving, not hiding, watching. Mr. Palmer. He stood pale, framed in silver light, his coat unbuttoned despite the chill, his expression not one of menace, but reverence. As Miss Marple stepped outside and approached him, the wind seemed to hush. "I didn't mean to intrude," he said softly. "You're not," Miss Marple replied gently. "You were drawn here. By the music." He shook his head. "By the silence. It's heavier than it used to be." She waited. "I lied," he admitted. "About the last time I saw Thomas." He looked down. It wasn't the afternoon. It was late, near midnight. Alistair had promised to play something, just for him, a lullaby. But the boy had already fallen asleep on a rug beside the fire. So I took the violin and tried to imitate the song he loved, a quiet melody. And when I looked up, Marjorie was standing there. Miss Marple nodded slowly. "You played for the boy, not as a student, but as a guardian of his peace." "And I never told anyone," he added. "I was afraid. Afraid Alistair would think I'd stolen something sacred." Miss Marple placed a hand gently on his sleeve. "You didn't steal anything. You gave it. There's a difference." Back inside, Alistair remained by the fire, unmoved. But his gaze had softened. He held the bough in his hand now, tracing the wood with his thumb, as though relearning its weight. "He heard it again last night," Marjorie whispered. "That's why he opened the case. The lullaby. It was never his alone, was it?" "No," Miss Marple replied. "It was Thomas's, and those who loved him each carried a part." Just then, the scraping returned, gentle now, almost careful. The floorboard near the hearth creaked ever so slightly. Miss Marple knelt, fingers brushing the edge of the worn rug. "Here," she said. "Help me lift it." Beneath, tucked between the slats of wood, was a folded handkerchief. Inside it, a tiny wooden music box no larger than a pocket watch. She wound it once. The tune was fractured, but unmistakable, a lullaby. Delicate, heart-wrought. Alistair's hand trembled. His eyes glistened. "I gave it to Thomas," Marjorie said faintly, after Alistair stopped playing. "He'd listen to it every night. I didn't know it was hidden there." Miss Marple closed the lid of the music box. Grief buries things. Love brings them back. This melody waited quietly. Alistair stood at last. Slowly, silently, he brought the bow to the strings. One long, aching note filled the room, neither polished nor perfect, but utterly human. And in that single sound, Silence was no longer absence. It was remembrance. It was forgiveness. Morning came with a gentler light than before, as though even the sun had chosen not to intrude too loudly on what had begun to shift within the walls of the Keene cottage. The mist from Ravenbridge Lane lifted slowly, revealing a countryside that held its breath, not out of fear, but anticipation. In Miss Marple's modest sitting room, the air was warm from a recently stoked fire, the kettle humming faintly from the kitchen. Marjorie Keene sat across from her, hands curled in her lap, like pages waiting to be read. There was no performance in her silence now, only readiness. Miss Marple, ever patient, poured tea into both cups, placing a single lavender biscuit on the saucer beside Marjorie's. The woman blinked once, twice, then spoke. "I wrote the letter," she said, voice threadbare but clear. "The one you found folded into the music book." Miss Marple did not look surprised. She simply stirred her tea, one slow circle, and said, "I thought as much." "I wasn't trying to deceive him," Marjorie continued, "only to remind him, to bring him back." She looked down, ashamed. "You have to understand, Miss Marple, after Thomas passed, something left with him. Alistair stopped playing. Not just the violin. He stopped everything. The world for him turned to ash. And her voice faltered. I became something like wallpaper. Present, patterned, unnoticed." The room held her confession like a held breath. "I thought if he remembered what music once meant, he might come back to me. To us. The letter wasn't signed because it wasn't supposed to be a lie. It was supposed to be a mirror." Miss Marple leaned back slightly, her expression not of judgment, but of profound understanding. "And the violin?" Marjorie's eyes brimmed. "He hadn't touched it in 3 years. But I thought maybe, just maybe, if he heard it again, even a whisper of it, it might unlock something. I took his old bow. I rosined it myself, my hands shaking all the while. I stood in the parlor at midnight and drew it across the strings, just once. I didn't expect sound, but I prayed he'd feel it." "You were trying to summon him," Miss Marple said gently. "Not to deceive him. There's a difference. But such things can unearth more than they intend." Marjorie nodded slowly. "I hadn't counted on Palmer returning. I hadn't counted on the music box being found. And I hadn't counted on how deeply he'd buried the guilt." "Guilt," Miss Marple said softly, "is a soundless thing. It doesn't scream. It hums beneath everything, waiting." A pause. "And Mr. Palmer?" Marjorie's eyes drifted toward the window. "He loved Thomas too. Maybe not as a father, but certainly not as just a student of the house. He was gentle with him, protective. I never questioned how much Alistair knew, or guessed." There was a longer silence now, not tense, but reflective. "I suppose," Marjorie whispered, "I just wanted to believe that if Alistair remembered how love once felt, he might forgive himself for the ways he failed, and forgive me too. I had been cruel once. Before Thomas. I had been someone he didn't deserve." Miss Marple folded her hands over her knees. "And yet here you are, the one who stirred the music again." At that moment, a soft knock came at the door. It was Alistair. He stood there not as a performer or composer or grieving father, but as a man with no mask left. In his hands was the music box. "I remember now," he said quietly, stepping inside. "The song. The night I first played it. Thomas had asked for something new, something no one else had heard. I made it up for him, and I never wrote it down." He looked at Marjorie. "You kept it safe. You heard what I could not, and I was too proud to see it." He placed the music box gently on the table, the wood smooth with age, the metal catch still warm from use. Miss Marple stood. She moved with a grace that seemed almost ceremonial. "I think," she said softly, "that sometimes music must be coaxed from silence, not forced, not demanded, but invited. And you've both done just that." Alistair turned to Marjorie, and for the first time in what felt like lifetimes, their eyes met without flinching. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what I buried, for the sound I took away." Marjorie stepped closer. "And I'm sorry for trying to make you feel it my way." The two of them stood inches apart, and though no one touched, the space between them warmed. Outside, the church bell struck one. Miss Marple looked at the clock, then at the fire, then at the two who had finally begun to speak in their shared language again. The following morning, Ravenbridge Lane lay still under a pale sky, the kind of silence that precedes either reconciliation or rupture. In the cottage, the Keens moved like people waking from a long fever, cautious, subdued, but somehow lighter. Yet Miss Marple, ever attuned to human dissonance, sensed a lingering note unresolved. A faint tension curled at the edges of their forgiveness, like the fray on an old violin string. She returned to the music room after breakfast, alone. The violin case remained on the low table, unopened but no longer sealed in grief. The bow, once hidden in desperation, now rested beside it, its horsehair taut ready. She ran a gloved finger along its handle and noticed something curious. An old nick, just under the grip, shaped like a crescent moon. Familiar. A quiet knock interrupted her reverie. It was Mr. Palmer. He entered with hesitation, holding a slip of paper in his hand. "I thought you ought to see this," he said. "It's from one of the programs at Alastair's last public performance, 7 years ago. The piece was called Elegy for a Child." His voice caught, but I knew, even then, he hadn't written it for Thomas. Miss Marple accepted the program and turned it over. On the back, in faint pencil, was the marking, "To M in another life." It was not Marjorie's initial. She looked up, understanding dawning. "You mean it was written for?" Palmer gave a tight nod. "Michael, a fellow student, gone before the war ended. Alastair never told anyone. Only me. But the grief, it came long before Thomas." His eyes glistened. Thomas was the second melody. A harmony he thought might drown out the first. Miss Marple exhaled slowly. "And Marjorie never knew." "I don't believe so. But perhaps she sensed it. Women often do, in silence." The fire crackled. Outside, the lane shimmered with low sunlight. Palmer stepped back, hesitating once more. "I didn't come to stir old ghosts. When I heard the violin play again, I thought perhaps he was finally ready to let the truth surface. Not just about grief, but love." Miss Marple nodded. "Truth must rise, Mr. Palmer, whether sung or whispered." Later that day, in the drawing room, Alastair and Marjorie sat together on the window bench. The violin, at last, lay open across Alastair's knees. Not as burden, as memory. Marjorie broke the silence first. "There was someone else, wasn't there? Before me." Alastair did not flinch. "Yes." She smiled faintly, not with bitterness, but with long overdue clarity. "And he gave you music." "Yes," Alastair whispered. "And you gave me silence. The kind that holds you when the music ends." Marjorie reached out and touched the scroll of the violin. "Then perhaps now we can begin again. A new piece. Not to forget, but to remember more truthfully." Miss Marple, standing just beyond the parlor arch, stepped back without a sound. She would not intrude on what must be rebuilt from within. But she smiled. That night, as the village fell into quiet once more, a single note floated over Ravenbridge Lane. Not loud, not flawless, but real. Alastair had begun to play again, and somewhere in the stillness, it was answered, not by applause, but by presence. That Sunday, as church bells tolled faintly through the damp morning, Ravenbridge Lane wore a hush not of sorrow, but of contemplation. Curtains were drawn back, fires quietly stoked, and in the Keens' cottage, the silence was no longer heavy. It was listening. Miss Marple arrived just after 9, carrying with her a small parcel wrapped in brown paper and tied with thin blue twine. Inside the cottage, Alastair sat with his violin again, not to perform, but to tend to it, with the reverence one gives to a grave or a letter never posted. Marjorie greeted Miss Marple with a gentleness that had not been present the week before. "He's tuning it," she said simply. "And himself, I think." Miss Marple smiled softly, then unwrapped the parcel on the kitchen table. It was an old photograph, faded at the edges, 3 young men, their collars rumpled, their eyes bright, seated on a conservatory step. One held a violin, the second, a folded sheet of composition paper, the third, Michael, In the background, unnoticed at first, a fourth figure, a girl in shadow, face turned to the light. Marjorie. I found it in a music anthology, Miss Marple explained. Perhaps tucked away for a reason. Perhaps waiting. Marjorie traced her finger over the edge. He never showed me this. No, said Miss Marple gently. But perhaps he hoped you'd find it. When you were ready to see the full measure of him. Marjorie said nothing, but her fingers lingered on Michael's shoulder, just long enough for acknowledgement. Upstairs, a note rang out. Low. Fragile. Then another. And another. Not a melody yet, merely threads. That afternoon, Miss Marple took tea in her cottage with Mr. Palmer. He had not returned to London. He'll play again, Palmer said. Not publicly, I suspect, but in truth. Miss Marple poured the tea and passed him the sugar. Some performances, she said, are meant for a single listener. Outside the window, a boy passed with a violin case of his own, head down, shoes scuffing the cobbles. A student, perhaps, or simply someone who had heard the echo from Ravenbridge Lane and felt drawn to its quiet music. In her diary that evening, Miss Marple wrote, Grief is rarely linear. It spirals, circles, returns when least invited. But when shared, it changes form, like music reinterpreted in new hands. Today I witnessed not the solving of a mystery, but the mending of a chord. And in doing so, I was reminded that truth, like music, is most powerful not in crescendo, but in its return to the root. The violin case, once locked in silence, now lay open on the parlor table, not as an invitation, as a remembrance, and in the gentle cadence of Alastair's playing, Ravenbridge Lane breathed again. Dawn crept slowly over Ravenbridge Lane the next morning, casting long, soft beams across the ivy-draped cottages and the dew-kissed hedgerows. The air was still, as if the village itself had paused to listen. In the Keene household, a hush remained, but not the kind stitched from grief or guilt. This silence was lighter, gentler, like breath held not in sorrow, but in reverence. Miss Marple returned just past 8, her steps quiet along the garden path. The door had been left slightly ajar, a quiet invitation rather than neglect. Marjorie stood by the hearth, hands loosely clasped, eyes fixed on the open violin case, resting on the armchair. Its strings were wound, its bow resined, its silence intact, but not untouched. Upstairs, Alastair sat by the window, the instrument across his lap, not to play, but to reflect. The morning light cast dappled shadows on the wall beside him, like notes falling from an unseen staff. He was not the man he once was, broken by silence, haunted by absence. Nor was he fully whole. But there was movement now, a shift. He held the violin not as a weapon against grief, but as a thread back to something gentle. Miss Marple entered quietly. It's remarkable, she said softly, how music can return long after the song is gone. Alastair looked up, eyes still rimmed with the sleepless night, but clear. I thought I'd buried it. Not just the notes, the part of me that believed in them. His fingers traced the wood's curve, but it waited, just waited. Miss Marple nodded. Music, like forgiveness, doesn't demand. It simply remains, until we are willing to return to it. They sat in companionable silence. Downstairs, Marjorie began to hum, faint and tuneless, but warm. And slowly, Alastair raised the violin. No prelude, no grand intention, just a single note, trembling and raw, blooming into the morning air. By midday, the lane had softened into its usual rhythm. Mrs. Holloway passed by with her terrier, offering a wave toward the Keene cottage. The postman delivered only a single envelope, unmarked, unurgent. Children ambled past with bread loaves and school bags, their chatter light. In her cottage, Miss Marple folded a letter she had written to an old friend. It read, there was no killer this time. No theft, no blackmail. Only a silence too deep, too long. And yet, it was perhaps the most difficult mystery of all, to understand not who committed harm, but how love, neglected, can wound just as deeply. We do not always need answers. Sometimes, we simply need to be still long enough to hear the music return. She placed the letter beside a stack of correspondence marked unsent. Some thoughts were meant to be written, not posted. Outside her window, Ravenbridge Lane exhaled. In the Keene's garden, Marjorie clipped a rose in bloom, white, with a hint of blush at the edge, and tucked it behind her ear. Alistair sat by the open window with the violin on his lap, bow idle, expression thoughtful. He didn't play again that day, but the door remained open, and in that, something shifted. Some mysteries end in revelation, others in restoration. And sometimes, Miss Marple mused, the deepest mystery lies not in what is hidden, but in what waits to be heard again, softly, truthfully, at the pace of the heart's return.